The sun had barely crept over the horizon when the roar of the drone shattered the stillness. Sarah jolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. Rushing to the window, she peered out to see the small, menacing craft hovering just above her backyard. Her fingers curled into fists as a wave of rage washed over her. "Those bastards," she muttered, her jaw clenched tight. For months, the Homeowners Association had been making her life a living hell, fining her for minor infractions, scrutinizing her every move. But now this was a violation of her privacy, her sanctuary. She wouldn't stand for it. Storming downstairs, Sarah flung open the back door, glaring up at the drone as it hovered silently. "Get the hell out of my yard," she yelled, her voice dripping with fury. When the drone refused to budge, she grabbed a nearby rake and swung it with all her might, knocking the device out of the air with a satisfying crunch. Chest heaving, Sarah watched as the drone tumbled to the ground, its camera lens shattered. She knew there would be consequences, but in that moment, she didn't care. This was her home, her domain, and she would be damned if she let the HOA trample all over it. Determined to fight back, Sarah rushed inside and powered up her laptop. Fingers flying across the keyboard, she began researching everything she could about drone laws and homeowner rights. If the HOA thought they could spy on her with impunity, they had another thing coming. Hours later, Sarah emerged from her office, a triumphant grin on her face. She had a plan, one that would send a clear message to the HOA and their drone-wielding minions. Grabbing a can of paint, she headed to the backyard, pausing only to glance at the crumpled drone lying in the grass. As the sun began to set, Sarah stood back and admired her handiwork. Emblazoned in bold, defiant strokes on the fence was a giant, unmistakable middle finger. She chuckled to herself, imagining the HOA's outrage when they saw it. Suddenly, the sound of a car engine drew her attention. Peering through the fence, she watched as the HOA president, Mrs. Wilkins, stormed up the driveway, her face twisted with fury. Sarah braced herself, ready to stand her ground. "Sarah Winters." Mrs. Wilkins bellowed, her voice shrill and accusatory. "What is the meaning of this obscenity?" Sarah stood her ground, unflinching in the face of Mrs. Wilkins' rage. "The meaning is quite clear, Mrs. Wilkins," she replied, her voice dripping with defiance. "You and your precious HOA have been spying on me with that drone, and I won't stand for it. This is my way of telling you exactly what I think of your little surveillance operation." Mrs. Wilkins' eyes narrowed to slits, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. "This is unacceptable, Sarah. You are in direct violation of our community guidelines. I'm giving you 24 hours to remove that _thing_ before we take legal action." "Legal action?" Sarah scoffed. "Go ahead and try. I've done my research, and I know my rights. You have no legal grounds to force me to take down my fence, and I'll be damned if I let you intimidate me." The two women glared at each other, the tension palpable. Mrs. Wilkins opened her mouth to retort, but before she could speak, a new voice joined the fray. "What's going on here?" a man called out, striding across the lawn. It was Sarah's neighbor, Bob, a retired police officer who had always been friendly with her. Mrs. Wilkins whirled around, her face flushed with anger. This _hooligan_ has defaced her fence with an obscene gesture, Bob. We need to put a stop to this immediately." Bob's gaze flicked from the fence to Mrs. Wilkins, and a look of understanding dawned on his face. "I see. And what, pray tell, were you doing in Sarah's backyard with a drone?" Mrs. Wilkins sputtered, her composure slipping. "That's none of your business, Bob. This is a matter for the HOA to handle." "Oh, I think it is my business," Bob said, his voice hardening. "I happen to know a thing or two about privacy laws, and if you were using that drone to spy on your neighbors, you could be in serious trouble." Sarah watched the exchange, a growing sense of triumph swelling within her. It seemed she had an unexpected ally in her fight against the HOA's overreach. Mrs. Wilkins' face paled as Bob's words sank in. She opened and closed her mouth several times, grasping for a response, but none came. The realization that her illegal drone surveillance had been uncovered was clearly weighing heavily on her. Seizing the opportunity, Sarah stepped forward, her posture confident and unyielding. "You see, Mrs. Wilkins, I'm not the one who's in trouble here. You and the rest of the HOA have been violating my privacy, and I won't stand for it. If you try to take any legal action against me, I'll be sure to make your little drone escapade public. How do you think the rest of the neighborhood would react to that?" Mrs. Wilkins' face contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. She glanced nervously between Sarah and Bob, her resolve visibly crumbling. Now, let's all just take a deep breath and try to find a reasonable solution to this," Bob interjected, his tone diplomatic but firm. "Sarah, I understand your frustration, but vandalism is never the answer. And Mrs. Wilkins, if what Sarah says is true, then you and the HOA have some serious explaining to do." Sarah and Mrs. Wilkins both opened their mouths to argue, but Bob raised a hand, silencing them. "I think it's best if we all sit down and have a calm, rational discussion about this. Perhaps we can find a way to resolve this matter without anyone having to take legal action." Reluctantly, both women nodded, realizing that Bob's intervention had diffused the immediate tension. Sarah knew that this was just the beginning of her battle against the HOA, but for now, she felt a surge of cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, she had a chance at winning this fight. As the three of them made their way towards the house, Sarah couldn't help but glance back at the fence, her giant middle finger standing as a bold testament to her defiance. She had drawn a line in the sand, and she was prepared to defend it with every ounce of her being. Inside Sarah's home, the atmosphere was tense as the three of them gathered around the kitchen table. Mrs. Wilkins sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, while Sarah and Bob settled into their chairs, ready to hash out this conflict. "All right, let's start from the beginning," Bob said, his gaze shifting between the two women. "Sarah, why don't you tell us exactly what's been going on with the HOA and this drone?" Sarah took a deep breath, her anger still simmering beneath the surface. "For months now, the HOA has been harassing me over the smallest things, the height of my grass, the color of my front door, even the placement of my flower beds. They've been nitpicking every little detail, and hitting me with fines left and right." She paused, her eyes narrowing as she fixed Mrs. Wilkins with a withering stare. "But today, they crossed a line. I woke up to find that _drone_ hovering over my backyard, spying on me. That's a complete violation of my privacy, and I won't stand for it." Mrs. Wilkins shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly feeling the weight of Sarah's accusations. "Now, Sarah, you have to understand that as the HOA president, it's my job to ensure that everyone in the community is following the rules and regulations. We have a responsibility to." "A responsibility to spy on your neighbors?" Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. "That drone wasn't monitoring the community as a whole, Mrs. Wilkins. It was focused solely on my backyard, and that's not okay." Bob raised a hand, cutting off Mrs. Wilkins' retort. "Let's all just take a step back here. Mrs. Wilkins, if what Sarah is saying is true, then the HOA's actions could be considered a serious breach of privacy. That's not something to be taken lightly." Mrs. Wilkins opened her mouth, then closed it again, her brow furrowed in thought. Sarah could see the wheels turning in her head, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Perhaps, for once, the HOA president was being forced to confront the consequences of her actions. The uneasy silence stretched on as the three of them sat around the kitchen table, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Mrs. Wilkins cleared her throat, her gaze fixed on the tabletop. "You're right, Sarah. The HOA shouldn't have been using that drone to monitor your backyard." She paused, swallowing hard. "The truth is, We've been receiving complaints from some of the other neighbors about the condition of your property. They felt it was bringing down the value of the homes in the area, and as the HOA president, I felt it was my duty to investigate. Sarah bristled at the implication, her fingers curling into fists. So you thought spying on me with a drone was the appropriate response? That's a gross invasion of my privacy, not to mention a total abuse of your power as the HOA president. Mrs. Wilkins winced, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. I know. It was a mistake, and I'm truly sorry. I got carried away trying to maintain the image of the neighborhood, and I lost sight of the fact that I was violating your rights as a homeowner. Bob nodded thoughtfully, his gaze steady. Well, I'm glad we're all acknowledging that here. Now the question is, how do we move forward from this? Sarah felt her anger begin to subside, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Perhaps there was a way to resolve this conflict without resorting to legal action or further escalation. I think the first step is for the HOA to publicly apologize for the drone incident, she said, her tone measured. And you need to make a commitment to respecting my privacy and personal property going forward. Mrs. Wilkins nodded slowly, her expression sober. That's fair. I'll make sure the HOA issues a formal apology, and we'll put a strict policy in place regarding the use of drones or any other surveillance equipment. I give you my word that this won't happen again. Bob smiled, his posture relaxing. Well, it sounds like we're making progress here. I'm glad we were able to find a reasonable solution to this problem. As the three of them continued to discuss the terms of the resolution, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, she had managed to stand up to the HOA and come out on top. But she knew this was just the beginning of her fight to protect her rights and her home. Over the next few weeks, the HOA made good on its promises. A formal apology was issued to the entire neighborhood, condemning the use of the drone and pledging to respect the privacy of all residents going forward. Sarah watched with a mixture of satisfaction and caution as the fallout from the incident unfolded. While some of her neighbors seemed relieved that the HOA had acknowledged its wrongdoing, others remained skeptical. Sarah could hear the whispers and see the sideways glances as she went about her daily life, and she knew that the battle was far from over. One afternoon, as Sarah was tending to her garden, she noticed Mrs. Wilkins approaching her, a somber expression on her face. Sarah, do you have a moment? The HOA president asked, her tone tentative. Straightening up, Sarah wiped the sweat from her brow and nodded. What is it, Mrs. Wilkins? Well, I wanted to follow up on our conversation the other day. Mrs. Wilkins began, her gaze shifting nervously. I know the apology was a good first step, but I wanted to make sure you were satisfied with the measures we've put in place to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. Sarah considered the woman's words, her expression guarded. I'd appreciate the effort, Mrs. Wilkins, but to be honest, I'm still a bit skeptical. The HOA has a history of overstepping its bounds, and I'm not sure I can trust that this won't happen again. Mrs. Wilkins nodded, her shoulders slumping slightly. I understand your hesitation, and I don't blame you. But I want you to know that we're committed to rebuilding that trust. We've enacted strict policies regarding the use of drones and other surveillance equipment, and we've even brought in an independent auditor to ensure we're following the rules. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. An independent auditor, huh? That's an interesting move. What exactly are they looking for? Well, they're going to be reviewing our policies and procedures, as well as looking into any potential privacy breaches or other violations, Mrs. Wilkins explained. Their goal is to ensure that we're operating in a way that's fair and transparent for all the residents. Sarah couldn't help but feel a twinge of skepticism. After all, the HOA had already shown its willingness to skirt the rules when it suited its own agenda. But the idea of an independent auditor did seem to hold some promise. All right, Mrs. Wilkins, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, Sarah said, her tone measured. But I want to be kept in the loop on this auditor's findings. I'm not going to just trust that you're doing the right thing." Mrs. Wilkins nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Fair enough, Sarah. I appreciate your willingness to give us another chance. I promise we won't let you down this time." As Mrs. Wilkins turned and walked away, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. She knew that the battle was far from over, and she was determined to stay vigilant in her fight against the HOA's overreach. In the weeks that followed, Sarah kept a close eye on the HOA's activities, closely monitoring the progress of the independent audit. Mrs. Wilkins had dutifully provided updates, assuring her that the auditor was thoroughly reviewing all the organization's policies and procedures. However, Sarah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The HOA seemed overly eager to showcase the auditor's work, going out of their way to emphasize the thoroughness of the review. It almost felt like they were trying too hard to convince her of their good intentions. One afternoon, as Sarah was checking her mail, she noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Bob, the retired police officer who had intervened in the drone incident. He had a serious expression on his face, and Sarah immediately knew that something was amiss. "Bob, what's going on?" she asked, her heart beginning to race. "Sarah, I've been doing some dating on that independent auditor the HOA brought in," Bob said, his voice low and urgent. "And I've got to tell you, I don't like what I'm finding." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean? What have you found?" Bob glanced around, as if to ensure no one else was listening. It turns out the auditor is actually a close personal friend of Mrs. Wilkins. They'd worked together on other HOA-related projects in the past, and by all accounts, they're in each other's pockets. Sarah's eyes widened, and she felt a surge of anger coursing through her. "You're telling me the HOA has essentially hired a sham auditor to cover up their own misconduct?" Bob nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. And from what I can tell, they're using this independent review to whitewash the whole drone incident and any other questionable practices they've been engaging in." Sarah clenched her fists, her mind racing. She had trusted the HOA to make amends, but it seemed that they had simply found another way to deceive her and the rest of the community. "We can't let them get away with this, Bob," she said, her voice laced with determination. "This is just another example of the HOA abusing their power, and I'm not going to stand for it." Bob nodded in agreement. "I'm with you, Sarah. We need to expose the sham of an audit and hold the HOA accountable for their actions. But we'll have to be careful. These people don't play by the rules, and they're not afraid to play dirty." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the fight ahead. Then it's time to play their game and win. With a renewed sense of purpose, Sarah and Bob set out to uncover the truth behind the HOA's independent audit. They knew they would have to tread carefully, as Mrs. Wilkins and her cronies were clearly willing to go to great lengths to conceal their misdeeds. First, they reached out to other members of the community, discreetly gathering information and building a network of allies. Many of the neighbors were outraged to learn about the HOA's deception, and they eagerly joined the fight to hold the organization accountable. Armed with this collective knowledge and support, Sarah and Bob began to systematically dismantle the HOA's carefully crafted narrative. They tracked down the auditor's background, uncovering the extensive ties between him and Mrs. Wilkins. They pored over the HOA's financial records, unearthing a web of questionable transactions and misappropriated funds. As the evidence mounted, Sarah and Bob knew they had to take their findings public. They reached out to the local media, pitching a story that would expose the HOA's corruption and abuse of power. After some initial skepticism, the journalists were intrigued by the revelations and agreed to investigate further. The day the story broke, the community was in an uproar. Residents flooded the HOA's offices, demanding answers and accountability. Mrs. Wilkins and her cohorts found themselves on the defensive, their carefully crafted facade crumbling under the weight of the damning evidence. In the end, the HOA was forced to disband, with Mrs. Wilkins and several other board members facing criminal charges for their misdeeds. The community celebrated their victory, with Sarah and Bob at the forefront of the celebration. As Sarah surveyed the scene, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and satisfaction. She had stood up to the HOA's abuse of power, and she had won. It was a hard-fought battle, but in the end, the truth had prevailed. Looking back on the events that had unfolded, Sarah knew that her defiant middle finger had been the catalyst for this remarkable turn of events. It had been a bold, provocative act, but it had also inspired her and her neighbors to fight back against the HOA's oppressive tactics. As she looked towards the future, Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope and optimism. The community had banded together, and they had proven that even the most powerful institutions could be held accountable. It was a lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her life, that sometimes the best way to fight back is to stand up, speak out, and refuse to back down.